So, what has been the relationship between Muslims and Europe? Muslims are neither newcomers nor outsiders in Europe, and in 20th century, they have been central to the continent's political development and the evolution of its traditions of equality and law. Join me in conversation with Dr. Emily Greble discussing her latest book, Muslims and the Making of Modern Europe, which offers a striking new account of a history of citizenship, nation building, the emergence of minority rights, and the character of secularism. She writes that Muslims have navigated through the continent's turbulent passage from imperial order through the interwar political experiments of liberal democracy, authoritarianism, to ideological programs of fascism, socialism, and communism. In doing so, Muslims have shaped the grand narratives upon which so much of Europe's fractious presence now rests. Welcome, Dr. Emily, to Haqq podcast. We are so glad to have you. Before we start discussing your wonderful book, Muslims in the Making of Modern Europe, I want to start with a couple of biographical questions. The first of which is, what were your intellectual influences or academic influences, and what made you take up the study or interest in this particular subject?
Thank you. And thank you so much for hosting me today. So I was trained as a historian of Yugoslavia, and my first book was about Sarajevo in World War II. And Sarajevo is a multi-confessional city with Muslims, Christians, and Jews, as well as a whole variety of other ethnic, national, confessional groups. And when I was finishing that project, there were a number of lingering questions that I had about specifically the role of Muslims. And I was sort of curious about some court cases that I had come across, both during the war, World War II, and also after World War II, in which Sharia law was being used by different judges in order to make sense of everyday problems and sort of family events. This was not something I had been trained or had read about in the broader Yugoslav historiography. And so I sort of began to dig around, and I wanted to specifically to understand that particular, that story. And as I did, I realized it was part of a much bigger European history. And of course, there were many scholars in the region who were writing about these things, but I discovered that they hadn't been fully sort of integrated into a larger European narrative, which I think is a main point of my book, is bringing back stories that have been erased from different European narratives of itself.
So, in your journey as an academician, how has the journey of how's your intellectual journey been? You said you started out as a historian of Yugoslavia, and then transited. So, in general, what have been kind of like the influences that you've had when it comes to your intellectual journey?
Yeah, so I'm still a Yugoslav historian. I still draw my histories from the archives and case studies of Yugoslavia, which is the main sort of central part
Mm-hmm.
of the middle of this book. But in terms of an intellectual journey, I found myself traveling. I mean, I think there was actually a physical journey as well. I took my two young children with me. We traveled throughout the Balkans, and I sort of went on a mission to find both archives and communities and people that I realized were sort of missing from these state-driven central narratives. So I was really excited about peripheries. I was excited to go to parts of today's North Macedonia, like Tetovo and Ohrid and Bitola. I was also really interested in traveling to more remote parts of Bosnia-Herzegovina and the Sanjak, and understand, what does Europe look like, and what does European history mean when we get into these smaller, sort of often sort of politically marginalized communities? What are their perspectives of how this history has been and their journey? So my own intellectual journey has very much been driven by my conversations with, for example, an imam in Tetovo. We sat outside and he served us tea, and my children played in the courtyard of the mosque. And those kinds of conversations really helped me sort of think about how I have been trained to think of history in one way, and the narratives I've been sort of spoon-fed about how states and political processes and legal processes developed were not necessarily the ways they developed on the ground. And as I started to get into Muslim perspectives in Southeastern Europe, they helped change my own journey and help me see history in a different way. So I'm very grateful to all the people who took care of my children, who had conversations with me, who had teas with me, who took walks with me, because often there's the archival part of it, but there was also sort of wrapping my head around a different narrative than the one that I had coming in.
Yeah, I absolutely saw that being reflected beautifully in your acknowledgement. And acknowledgements are like sometimes the best part of the book that I like reading about. So moving on, I also want to talk about, in this journey of writing the books, you must have come across limitations while accessing these records for writing the book. What did these limitations look like? Like, what sort of methodology that you were using? And how was it different than what mostly exists in the field?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's two different limitations that one has. The first is limitations to or access to knowledge, right? Now, in my case, the former Yugoslavia has the best archivists in the world, and they everything is pretty much open. If you sit down, you talk to people, they want to help historians. I mean, of course, there's always, always exceptions, but I found throughout the region, in every country I visited, I worked in multiple countries, in every archive I went to, there was a real desire to help me figure out what was there and how I might access it. So that was huge. It was really helpful. But of course, archives are established by states. You're a historian, you know this, right? They're established by states. History is done often through institutions. And so trying to make sense of sort of how does history look like from the perspective of a group that is traditionally marginalized, who is more complicated. It means both reading against the grain, right? Using state archives to make sense of where did I find Muslims? Are, the ministries of education, for example, reports about schools, the Justice Department, reports about how courts were going to be structured, but also sort of consulate reports, for example, in an exchange between the Yugoslav consulate in Ankara and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Belgrade, I discovered a whole set of documents and discussion on a possible population transfer that I, had not been particularly familiar with before. So kind of reading against the grain is important. Also, I think it's really critical to try and find other kinds of sources. So I work with Muslim memoirs, unpublished travelogues, letters. I dug deep into the records of the Waqf, which in South Slavic is called Vakuf, which is similar to the Turkish. So going through those records, so Muslim institutional records, as well as madrasas, mektabs, mufti papers, those kinds of things, and sort of piecing this together, because of course these stories are not happening in isolation, right? And they're not happening in parallel. So what's happening in the archives of the madrasas or in the Waqf is also happening in the state archives, but trying to figure out where they go together and how they're each perceiving and understanding a different moment is part of the historical work that I do.
Yeah, that's an interesting approach, and it definitely challenges the kind of conventions that we hold when we come down to writing such books, and especially in narrative-driven books where we are able to read against the grain. Mm-hmm. Coming to questions about the book, for the benefit of our listeners, could you introduce the themes of your book and who are these Muslims that you're talking about in the book, The Muslims of Europe?
Great. So the book begins in 1878 with the Congress of Berlin and the shattering of an Ottoman order in southeastern Europe. And the Muslims at the center of the book, which range at any given time from 1 to 2 million Muslims, are Ottoman Muslims, subjects of the Ottoman Empire, who become absorbed by other European states after this moment. And there's a series of wars and political boundary changes that I trace. So, a certain group gets absorbed in 1878, another group in 1912, another group in 1913, 1918, 1923. There's all sorts of population shifts that are happening along with the shifts of political boundaries. But ultimately, the question that I was asking is sort of what does it mean for these Ottoman Muslims to become citizens of other European states? And I do see the Ottoman Empire as a European state. So we sort of have this shift. What did state building and nation building look like from their perspectives? What kinds of compromises were developed in law, education? And how does sort of thinking through their stories and their perspectives change the way we understand this development and evolution of European states more broadly? So initially in the book, the first few countries that I focus on are Serbia, Montenegro, and Austria-Hungary, and a few references to Greece and Bulgaria. And then in the middle of the book, we also get into Yugoslavia, which is founded in 1918, and I take that through World War II. And I end in the early communist period, in the 1940s, early 1950s. And so really it's like a collective biography of multiple generations of Muslim men, women, children, muftis, imams, religious practitioners, also merchants, businessmen, farmers. I look at urban settings, port towns, coastal places like Bar and Ulcin, but I also look at interior sort of villages along what is today sort of the Kosovo and North Macedonia border. And I try to sort of bring together a whole variety of very diverse communities, and their diversity extends to not only to sort of where they live and class and sort of relationship to place, urban, rural, coastal, mountainous, but also diversity in terms of how they practice and understand Islam. So predominantly the communities at the center of the book are Sunni Muslims who practice sort of a similar version of Islam as in Ottoman Turkey. But there are also many communities who were Sufi, and also communities that practice sort of syncretic or kind of customary approaches, which is common across the Ottoman Empire. And so I try to really think about diversity in terms of sort of space, class, region, religious culture, and also there was one other aspect. Oh, language. They speak and write and read in many different languages. So my primary research language is Serbo-Croatian, but the people that I'm working on worked with, many wrote in Ottoman Turkish, Arabic. They also spoke Albanian, Roma, a variety of South Slavic languages. So that's kind of the diversity. So I'm trying to take a look at, I know I'm going on a little bit. So I take a look at all of these different communities over the course of many different, of many generations, and make sense of what they can tell us about the changing European project.
Yeah, thank you so much. And definitely on this podcast, we could never take too much time describing something that we really love the narrative and we really love listening out. So that brings me to the second question is, you spoke about the breaking down of the Ottoman Empire and the question of citizenship. So the question is about how during the eras of the World War, the shifting borders of Europe in 19th and mid 20th century, how is that shaping the identity of Muslims of Europe, the changing of political borders, and especially about their political belongingness?
Yeah, so part of the book begins with this idea that in 1878, there's a shift in the understanding of the possibilities of what Muslims can be. Prior to 1878, when borders changed, Muslims, especially in borders with Ottoman Empire changed, Muslims were presumed to be kind of associated and part of the Ottoman Empire. And so they were deported or they voluntarily left. But there was this sense, and if they stayed, there was a sense that they were foreign. There were small groups of Muslims, for example, who stayed in Greece and Serbia, but they had been understood to be kind of still Ottoman citizens. And this was part of a broader sort of system of extraterritoriality and understandings of political belonging. But something starts to change in 1878. We have new discourses of humanitarianism and liberalism and citizenship. And so when sort of the great powers allow Serbia, Montenegro, Greece, Austria-Hungary to claim these Ottoman lands, they put a lot of pressure on them to give all men citizenship regardless of religion. And that includes Muslims and Jews, and they do. And so we have this shift after, and this is sort of where this idea of what is modern Europe, right? It's this notion of sort of citizenship and equality and liberalism that is emerging after 1878. Now, the project of equal citizenship does not always work out the way people anticipate it will. Many people don't want citizenship. I opened the book with a story of a man named Abdullah. I was like, I don't want to be a citizen. I don't want to fight in your army. I don't want to pay taxes. I don't want to send my kids to Christian school. I'm an Ottoman, right? And so we have these examples where citizenship doesn't always mean the people who are sort of forcefully given it want it. But it is a political rubric, and it's different in Southeastern Europe than it is in, for example, the British Empire or the French Empire, where Muslims are understood as a distinct legal other all along. They don't have the same rights as Christians without especially in most of the French Empire, without renouncing Islam. And so we have this kind of example here. We don't always think of the Balkans as kind of where sort of liberalism and progressivism was being worked out, but I think it's an important case study of how it is starting to be worked out and how these ideas of European citizenship are creating space for people who are not Christian and also creating limitations. And there was this constant tension that we see in the late 19th and early 20th century between these kind of possibilities of citizenship and the pressures, what it means to give up something and what that is and who gets to decide. And there's a lot of sort of complaints and criticisms that this equal citizenship is actually just, an attempt by other states to sort of Christianize Muslim populations. And there are certainly moments where that is exactly what they're trying to do. There are even cases of forced conversions. But then there's other cases where new political leaders are taking things like religious freedom really seriously and asking Muslim leaders, Islamic scholars, what is religious freedom to you? How does that look like? How do we integrate it? And so we find this whole sort of set of unusual compromises and negotiated policies that happen in Southeastern Europe that I think are really useful for everybody who's intrigued by European history to understand and to integrate into our own understandings of sort of the possibility of the concept of citizenship.
So that actually brings me to the next question. Like, with all of that happening in the Balkans, what are the methods, or like how are the Muslims trying to cope themselves with that changing attitude, like especially with changing meanings of religious freedom and marginalizations and disposition of citizenship?
Mm-hmm.
How are some of the things that they try to integrate themselves?
Do you mean today, or you mean in historical past?
In historical perspective, like
Mm-hmm.
How are they able to do that to themselves?
So there's this real understanding for many Muslims in Southeastern Europe that they can't go back, right? There's a couple of decades where people do want the restoration of the Ottoman Empire. And then gradually there's this sense and understanding of how do we move forward? And there's a wonderful historian of law and Islam in Sarajevo, Elhimana Mamišević, who's writing about sort of the tensions within the Islamic legal world over how Muslims were understanding the stay versus the leave. Like, was it actually, should they actually leave these Europeanizing, Christianizing states, or should they stay? Like, where was the right balance? And so we have these widespread debates that are going on, and a sense of what is Muslim identity going to be outside of the Ottoman Empire and in these nationalizing states? For many Muslims, they join the different nationalizing groups. The Yugoslav idea is open to people of all faiths. And so in the 1920s and 30s, and also again in the socialist period, we have many Muslims who identify, they speak the South Slavic language, they participate in the South Slavic culture. Likewise, you have Muslims who identified as Serbian and who identified as Croat, and who understood their own identity as, that those were not in conflict with one another. One could be both a member of a nation and a member of a religious community, and that they could go together. Where we find tensions and challenges is when those larger projects try to define what Islam is going to be, when they try to use state structures to supervise and interfere in the practices of the faith itself. And so then we find different groups of Muslims trying to develop other kinds of social, political, cultural communities. And in the book, I talk quite a bit here about how in the 1930s, one of the ways that Islamic scholars start to do that is by sort of narrowing their own interpretations of what is Islam, trying to streamline Islamic thought and practice, and all of the diversity that I described earlier, sort of remove a lot of that diversity and develop a singular sort of Islamic community. And they're borrowing from ideas of Islamic legal revivalism and the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. Many are studying in Egypt, right, and coming back and trying to make sense of, okay, what does it mean to be a political minority? And how do we protect Islam from these states that are interfering and discriminating against Muslims and prevent the kind of dissolution of a community? What does that mean and look like? And so there's different paths that happen, but that's one of them.
So, how is the response from the other side? Like, how do Muslim or how does Europe or the European grand narrative kind of absorb Muslims, or does it? The first question is like, if it does, how does it do that? You spoke about state interference and how the state was trying to use religion. What do those interactions, especially from state actors, look like?
Do you mean, just for a little bit of clarification, how they kind of erase Muslims, or how they try to absorb Muslims? I missed the first part of your question.
What was the kind of response Europe had to the Muslims who were left? Like you spoke about how Muslims felt in Europe. The question was like, what was the European state? How was that looking down to Muslims? Like, what was happening? How did the European states imagine Muslims in their states? Yeah.
Great. So they have different states had different perceptions of sort of Muslims within their societies. Early on, there's actually quite a bit of negotiation. And there's, for example, in Austria-Hungary, a real effort to kind of make sense of Muslims and keep them. And of course, there's geopolitical reasons for that. In Austria-Hungary, there was a lot of resistance from, for example, Serb minorities, they're not minorities everywhere, but the Christian Serb population, they don't want to be part of Austria-Hungary, right? And so there was an alliance between the political elite of Austria-Hungary and the elite Muslim classes. And so there is also then within that, if you want to have an alliance, there's, a quid pro quo, and the Austrians give Muslim leaders some control over what that relationship is going to look like. In other parts of the region, there's different responses. And often it depends on the language one spoke. So for example, in Serbia, but also in interwar Yugoslavia, there was a lot of effort to integrate and keep Slavic-speaking Muslims, but not Albanian-speaking Muslims. There was this sense that there was conflict within different linguistic communities, and that one was more compatible than the other. But we hear this language of compatibility, I think, everywhere in Europe, and I would question whether it's a little bit disingenuous, right? Are the values of a state being imposed on everybody, or are they incorporating people's views in the establishment of those values?
So that brings us to the next part of the question is how does this work become relevant to Muslims of contemporary Europe? How does this reshape how Muslims are in this day and age perceived in the imagination of Europe? They place in the identity of being something European, um, not as something something that's foreign. That's people coming from Middle East or South Asia, or other places, Muslims who are indigenous to
Mhm.
the identity of Europe. Yeah.
So I think that there's a couple of things going on here. The first is, there's this rhetoric that emerges, especially in Islamophobic discourse, but it also is sort of more sort of under the surface that Muslims are migrants, that they're guest workers, that they're refugees, that they're foreigners. And there's often this language in European sort of political discourse that depicts Muslims as both new and foreign. That they don't belong in Europe, that they're not of Europe, as the anthropologist Talal Assad had once written. But I think it's important, and part of what my book shows is that this is rhetoric, and it was rhetoric that was used in the 19th century as a way of sort of legitimizing the conquest of Muslim lands and shifting power dynamics. It was always in the interest of Europeans to sort of have this rhetoric, because then they could remove or marginalize Muslims or sort of claim that they, were not legitimately there. And this rhetoric then gets, I think, adapted in the 20th century in different ways, right? I mean, most guest workers were invited to the countries where they are. And then somehow the discourse is spun so that now suddenly they're foreigners. But we're even in Western Europe, and many generations of these so-called foreign migrants are in our fifth, sixth generation. I mean, these are not migrants and foreigners and others. These are Europeans. And they may be Muslim, right? And they may be Christian, and they may be Jew, right? They have all sorts of religious backgrounds and cultural backgrounds. But at this point, the notion of foreignness really sort of perpetuates, I think, the idea of Islamophobia, and it removes space for Muslims to have their own narratives within European history. So I think, big picture wise, understanding that this is rhetoric, that it's been rhetoric, right? And making sense of it in those terms is really helpful. I think another kind of takeaway for today and our contemporary European society is that we have this myth that secularism has been static, that secularism meant the same thing over different periods of time, that it's religion neutral, and that it was free of religious influence. And part of what the book shows and asks us to think about in a broader sense is the Christian norms and values and legacies that were sort of embedded in this idea of secularism. And I think, if we want to kind of take a comparative approach, the French Empire had different citizenship laws for Muslims, right? In Germany, people paid a percentage of taxes toward religious institutions. Secularism was always about sort of power and a relationship between sort of religious groups and states. And as it developed, certain things became sort of more comfortable to kind of European majorities. So, for example, I write at one point about why are we more comfortable with segregated restrooms, right? By gender, the men's room and the women's room, but we're not comfortable with segregated swimming pools. And then there was just a big, conflict in France. Or why is it okay that, blue laws that banned factory work on Sundays? Or why is there a comfort with the idea that stores will be closed on Christmas and Easter? But at different moments when Muslims ask for store closures on Friday or even just personal accommodations, somehow this is suddenly the incursion of Islam in the public sphere, right? Well, that's an imposition, I think, of and a misreading of the past. And what we see in Southeastern Europe was that it was not always that way. There was lots negotiation over what the secular ideas were going to be. And then there's moments of sort of enforced pressure and making sense of sort of our own complicity in that as European scholars, as those of us who study and write and think and teach about Europe, I think is really, really important. So those would be kind of the two areas I'd say. I could talk more about any of this, but
Yeah,
I'm learning to keep answers shorter.
No, actually, it works the other way in the podcast. We as I mentioned, we expect and hope to listen long answers. But coming back on that, actually, I wanted to ask a question, which I'd kept for towards conclusion is the idea, something that even I, as a student of history, am trying to grapple with, is that how do the things that we discuss in scholarship in academia um, enter mainstream narrative? It usually remains eluded. This is a very constant discussion I have with my professors as well, as to, well, we do what we do, but this is in the four walls of university. And as much as, books in academic scholarship is written, the audience for it, however, might not be the most uh, it is not a very wide audience who consumes the kind of content, and which is why one of the objectives of the podcast was to popularize academic knowledge. But in this case, how do you think that the emerging scholarship of Muslims in Europe is kind of eluding mainstream narratives? And how do you think, or as a historian, like, what do you think can be done in order to bring those gaps, fill those gaps?
Yeah, it's another great question. I mean, this is really tough, right? And it's one of the reasons why I put myself outside of my own comfort zone and do podcasts and radio shows and interviews. I did a radio interview 2 months ago with Voice of Islam, and it was live, and it was really scary. As professors, we're used to being in our own little bubbles. And I just did a TV interview in Turkey that'll be shown next week. And these are, I think talking about our ideas is really important, and that bringing them outside of the academy is critical. And being open to different perspectives, right? And a lot of times, I gave a talk recently in Serbia in Serbian, and a colleague of mine said, "You need to let the American embassy know that you're speaking about Muslims in Serbia, and there's a war going on." And I'm like, well, that's what I have to do. I need to go there, and I need to speak in Serbian to Serbs and talk about ideas and listen and share my perspective and listen to their perspectives. And that's how we move, I think, into a different place. And I think it's slow, hard work. And that is, the work of people like you with your podcast that we're doing it. And I think that, we need to build more trust between sort of the public and professors, because I think professors, have a reputation of not wanting to leave our classrooms, because for many of us, we don't. I mean, we like being, reading and writing our books and lecturing in that kind of space. And there can be some real public backlash. So I think the public needs to be a little nicer sometimes to professors. And I think professors need to be more in the public and doing more of these kinds of things. And then slowly, hopefully, the dialogue will transform. But that's the best I've got. I also think textbooks need to change. I really have an issue with the way history is taught in European textbooks, but that's not something I have any control over.
There was an active discussion in our class that if textbooks are ever going to quit pushing propaganda in public, because they are one of the strongest tools to have been there in construction of the ideas of nation state. Which brings me to the question about when you mentioned about secularism, how it's perceived in Europe as a static idea. If you could elaborate that for our audience on the questions with probably more vibrant examples of it.
Sure. So I think we get the biggest case of this is laïcité in France, and the sense that laïcité has always meant the same thing. But there's actually a number of scholars who have written about this quite widely, including a really great anthropologist, John Bowen, who talks about how secularism in France meant different things at different moments. Up until 1905, it didn't exist in the way we think of it today. But there were even exceptions made. There were exceptions made for, in Alsace-Lorraine for the Protestants. And in the 1920s, the French government funded the mosque in Paris. How is that secularism, right? If you've got this sort of direct relationship going on. And so I think what we need to do is understand that secularism is a product of a particular moment and question and challenge how that has come to be. And I think, there's other historians. For example, there's a great new book by Lauren Stokes called The Fear of the Family, which looks at the ways that sort of ideas of secularism and race intersected in post-war Germany, and particularly racialized Muslim communities through that process, and how sort of what that meant in terms of German secularism. And as I said, Bowen's books on French secularism. So we do know, again, as academics, that there isn't a single thing, right? But it's harder in the public, and it's harder when you've got sort of mainstream politicians who are like the incursion of Islam and, creeping Sharia, and these sort of terrible politicized phrases that are really being used to sort of fearmonger, but aren't actually grounded in history. And I feel like if, the general public sort of stopped and thought about that, they would realize, wait a second, we're being fed something. Why are we just allowing people to feed us a false narrative? And why, there isn't a single secularism, and it hasn't existed in the same form. So how do we understand that? So that's where I think we're at with the secularism question.
Yeah. So I also wanted to talk about the title of your book, Muslims in the Making of Modern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
I found the use of making and modern both a very interesting choice. How do you think Muslims were in any way making or contributing in the making of modern Europe?
Yeah. So when we think about modern Europe as historians, or the modern period typically begins right with the French Revolution and these new ideas of state and citizenship, and the sort of shifting ideas of what that's going to look like after. So we kind of have a line between early modern and modern that I think many of us are trying to now challenge, right? But historically, there's been this scholarly line. And so part of the making of modern Europe, well, first of all, titles, publicists and marketing teams create titles as much as authors. But part of what we were getting at in our conversations with that is that the book wants to make sense of sort of how these ideas of what modern Europe is, ideas like citizenship and religious freedom and liberty and secularism, how those ideas were shaped both through sort of Muslim engagements and how they were understood by Muslims as agents within them. And so the making part there is really about agency. Oftentimes, especially in Southeastern Europe, Muslims have been described and written about in more passive terms and victim terms as people who were being acted upon, as opposed to people who were actively engaged. And there was certainly a lot of repression and violence and discrimination, and I talk about that. But there was also a lot of opportunity. Muslims were agents in these processes. They were fighting in armies. They were helping draft constitutions. The 1921 Yugoslav constitution was partially drafted by Muslims, and there's a clause in it that enshrines a Sharia judiciary. They are writing laws. They're developing education policy. And when they're not developing it and it's being imposed, they're resisting and pushing back, which then forces conversations. At times, they're picking up arms to say, wait a second, why are you arbitrarily drawing a border here in the middle of our villages, separating our families? what does that make sense? So the making part is kind of twofold. It's both the ways Muslims are agents within this process of European state and nation building, and also sort of their own sort of stakes in what that's going to look like.
So this is kind of like bringing us to the conclusion of the interview. And there are a couple of questions that we've recently decided that if the author is comfortable in answering these questions, and you can ask. And set of these questions are about kind of like the personal challenges that an author has, an academician has. Mostly for our audience or members in our audience who want to pursue academics or want to pursue a career in academics. Some of the questions that we've often seen is about how receptive is academia of female scholars, or how receptive is academia of scholars who are probably mothers, keeping their like their needs or their family times and things of these personal times in mind. So if you're comfortable talking about it, or if you want to give your opinion on it, how has this journey of writing and being a scholar, an academician, a historian, been for you personally? Because reading the acknowledgement section of your book, and also the book in general, your family has been a very important part in accomplishment of this achievement. So if you have something to tell us about that.
Absolutely. So I have two children, and they have lived this book with me literally since they were in the womb. My oldest son, I was pregnant with him when I went on my first research trip. I am as you know, I've mentioned, I am really in love with archives, and I am a researcher, and I travel, and that requires time and money and flexibility, and doing it with two small children. My kids are now 8 and 10. So, you know, and this started when the 10-year-old was in utero, and then that trip I brought the dog, which had its own challenges. You know, has been really complicated. I'm very lucky to have an incredibly supportive partner. He's also in academia, which was sort of a choice we actively made together. He was practicing architecture, and we decided to he shifted into academia, in part so that we could have a life where we were each sort of intellectually stimulated, and we also had a family. And so we tend to divide our summers. Half of it is for my research, half of it is for his research, and we would swap off in terms of, you know, childcare. I have been incredibly lucky with a whole network of support from childcare providers who, you know, I think they think I'm a little silly because I still send them holiday and New Year's cards every year, you know, and there's Lida in Novi Pazar, and there's Antonia in Zagreb, and they, you know, just became a support system for me and our kids. And so I bring the children with me almost on every research trip. And they understand that mothers work and also are present. And, you know, we get up at 5 a.m. to have breakfast beforehand. And, you know, I feel like if, you know, I think of all the women who do it during Ramadan, I can do it, you know, in the summer, you know, and cook a meal early in the morning before heading off to the archive, right? I mean, I think that it's a question of balance and priorities. For me, it was never, I was not willing to give up either. And so I've figured out a way to make it both work. But my husband, as I said, has been really, truly a partner in all of that, which was great. And I'm also really lucky that I have a stable academic job. That is something that a lot of people right now don't have. And I work in a university that really supports me and, you know, provides me with the financial resources that I need, and sort of understands that, that, you know, there's families and academia, and they go together. And that's very rare in the US. It's more, you know, more common in Europe, I think, where these things go together, but in the US, it's not that common. So I count my blessings and hopefully use them to produce good scholarship.
That's wonderful. And we come to a conclusion of the interview. The last question we have is, what should our audience be looking forward to? What work should we be looking forward to coming from you, or keep an eye out for?
You
And
mean
like, what
my
are you
future
working
work?
on? Yeah, like, are you working on something right now?
I am. I just presented it for the first time last week at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm working right now on the 1820s and the 1830s and the ways, particularly in Serbia, but I'm hoping also to look at Bosnia, the ways that sort of law and the European legal project was developed through encounters with marginalized communities in the borderlands. So I'm particularly looking at instances of slaves, of peasant women, of Muslim migrants, Jewish communities, Roma, who were sort of moving between spaces and trying to understand their legal sort of agency. Again, I'm excited about agency, how they were operating within this world, but also how they were starting to shape it. Because I think that some of the big questions that left me with this last book are, how did we even get to the secularism and religious freedom and liberty stories of the 1880s and 90s and early 1900s. And I think that part of that story actually requires going back to this slightly earlier period of the making of modern Europe.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us on Haqq.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning into this conversation. We really hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, please consider subscribing to our channel and podcast for more such amazing content. We have a series of amazingly curated interactions with authors and scholars on the issues of contemporary relevance. Do check out our website, www.ergostudios.com, for more blogs and podcasts exploring the tales of contemporary relevance. Do follow us on our social media sites for more exciting updates. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.